Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Thriving Adoptees podcast. So today I'm delighted to be joined by Nina, all the way from Chicago. So Nina, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Happy to be here.
Happy for you to be here too. So, and I know that listeners, you're in for a real treat because Nina's been working in post-adoption support for 17 and a half years now. And she's been all that time. She's been working at the Cradle in Chicago, and she's working post-adoption support. And she's worked herself up now. So you're director of post-adoption support. That's correct, yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. So those 17 and a half of years, it's like a wealth of learning, which we're going to explore with you today, Nina. So I'm really looking forward to doing that.
Sounds good.
Sounds good. Let's get into it. So when you hear this phrase, thriving adoptees, or I guess we're talking today about thriving adopted adults, thriving adult adoptees, thriving adopted people, what comes to your mind when you hear this phrase, thriving adoptees?
Yeah, it's actually very interesting, right? Because I may think something, but an individual may think something different, right? About what that means by thriving, and somebody from the outside versus somebody from the inside, right? Because appearances are what people look at, right? So you see somebody who might be successful, who may have everything they, could need in life, and somebody may think that they look thriving and they look like they're successful, but potentially inside they're struggling with some issues. And, adoption is complex, and you could have the most wonderful parents and the most wonderful life and opportunities, but you still might be struggling with some of those core issues in adoption. And so when we think of somebody that might be thriving in adoption, I think that perhaps they've, worked through some of those issues, maybe some of those issues of loss or rejection or identity, right? Trying to figure out who they are, have positive relationships. But I think those type of things ebb and flow, right? So at different points in an adoptee's life, they've struggled with things and maybe worked through them. And maybe there's still certain things that they struggle with from time to time. So I think it's kind of an up and down path, I would say, for somebody who's thriving.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I asked that question to a fellow adult adoptee on a previous podcast, and she said, "Well, this is so a adoptee called Rebecca Autumn Sansom. You can check out her podcast, her episode of the podcast. So she's made a film with Nancy Verrier, the author of the Primal Wound. And so Rebecca is very out there in terms of she's very public about this film that she's making, Reckoning with the Primal Wound. And I asked her what she thought about thriving, and she said, "Well, I don't consider myself as thriving." And I thought, well, that's really interesting because I've had a conversation with before. She's very out there in the world. She seems to be, to my opinion, right? My opinion, she's thriving, but she didn't consider herself. So it's clearly a very personal issue, and it means different things to different people.
Definitely. The other thing too, just because you mentioned that book, I think when sometimes when you bring up issues like some of these core adoption issues to people, that maybe the adopted person starts to think about some of those things, right? Like they hadn't realized that maybe some issues they had or some difficulties with relationships or whatnot, that they hadn't connected it to their adoption, right? So that's another interesting piece where you maybe are struggling with certain things. And then when you have the language or you have the context, you can connect it. And I think that can be helpful too for adopted people to recognize, like, oh, now I understand. I thought it was just me, or, I was the only one that felt that way. But then when you learn a little bit more about how other adopted people feel and some of the complexities of adoption and some of those core issues, you get it put into context for yourself. Sometimes in a good way, and other times, right?
Yeah.
It's like, ooh, I didn't think of it that way. So maybe I didn't want to think of it that way.
Yeah.
So well, I guess it could go both ways.
It can, and I think this whole area fascinates me because I kind of did that. I worked through some business stuff. So my self-worth, my identity was very tied in with business success, right?
Yeah.
So I struggled with that for an awful long time, and I didn't really struggle with any adoption stuff, and then I did struggle with some adoption stuff, and then I worked through that. I worked through the whole lot, and then I read The Primal Wound, and I thought, well, this explains some more. And I thought about it. Yeah, you said something when we think about it. I thought about it more, and I'm quite susceptible. I'm quite sensitive. I was brought up very honest by my parents, so I tend to take things on board quite easily. Take a new idea on board quite easily.
Okay.
And that new idea can be a good idea or a bad idea.
Right.
So for me, I didn't feel wounded until I read The Primal Wound. And I thought, well, this explains a load more. And that actually took me down. And I have talked about this on previous episodes, but when I realized that what was going on for me, in my opinion, were human issues, not adoption issues, that freed me up. Because for as long as an issue was tethered to something that happened, a lifetime ago, 48 years ago, when I went through this, for as long as my mood, my consciousness, my level of being was tethered to something that happened 48 years ago, I was stuck. And then when I realized it was a human issue rather than an adoption issue, that set me free.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting, right? Because just because you're adopted doesn't mean that you're also, like you said, a person. And people have lots of different issues, and people are complex, right? We all have things that happened to us in the past and things that are happening right now. And people come in and out of our lives, and situations come in and out of our lives. I think for adopted people, there's just that decision, right? Is this an adoption thing, or is this, just like you said, a human thing? And sometimes it's obvious, and other times it's not. But I think when you think about The Primal Wound, I've heard so many different things from people. Some adopted people have shared they read the book and it answered all their questions, and it just was so important and meaningful to them. And other people have read it and they, threw the book across the room and said, this is nothing, this is just not, that's not true, and that's not me. So, I think that no one person is the same as another person. And that's okay. I think that's a normal reaction, that for one person it's super meaningful, and for other people it's not.
I've seen that too. That they agree with and disagree with. What I haven't heard from other people, and maybe I haven't done enough, is the kind of the transition that I went through. So I thought, this explains everything, right? And then and that took me down. And then I realized, and then I thought, this isn't true.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting.
I had that change. I had that change, and I had that that change of view of it. And I've talked about this quite a lot. there's another episode if people are interested in looking at this. There's an episode with a guy called Nick, a fellow Brit called Nick Mabey, who was Mabey in the back catalogue. People can check it out. So a fellow adoptee, and we discuss the primal wound. We discuss our own patient of it deep, but so that's probably not one to get into today.
No, and that's not really my
that's your
area of specialty at all.
So you talked about adopted people deciding whether an issue was an adoption issue or a human issue.
Right.
So this whole area is fascinating for me because I see our minds as meaning-making machines. So we're always looking to pin something on something. We're looking for cause and effect.
Okay.
We're looking for cause and effect. We're looking for a reason why something's happening, and we often, as adoptees, we often blame adoption. That's kind of my take on it. How would you say it?
Yeah, I think that I guess when I think of all adoption and the way people view things, I honestly, everything, I use this phrase all the time, I think of a bell curve, right? So on one end of the bell curve, there's people that are very clear and they relate everything to their adoption, right? It's, this is because of the adoption. This is because of the decisions my birth parents made. This is because of the way my adopted parents raised me, or how much I knew or didn't know about my adoption. But whatever the reason is, that they're just very convinced that it's related to the adoption, as you say. And then there's people on the other end of the bell curve, right? Where they say, well, my life has nothing, okay, fine, I was adopted, but all of the decisions and the choices that I made and things that happened to me were because of me and just what I did. I don't really think about my adoption in relation to that. And then there's the middle of the bell curve where there's everything in between, where maybe some things a person can relate back to their adoption and other things they don't, because there's other things that have happened in your life, right, besides being adopted. And maybe you do connect those to adoption or not. So I think of the bell curve. And so that's the way I explain it. And that's the experience that I've had when I've talked to adult adopted people that call the Cradle for our services, whether they're calling to just learn more about their adoption, learn about the birth family, learn about why the decisions were made, or whether they are interested in seeking out birth family. Again, I think it's that same thing. I hear some people that it's super important and super meaningful, and this is something they've always thought about. And then on the other end, people that say, well, I'm not interested, but my children want me to do this. And then of course, everything in the middle where they share, over the course of my life, at different times in my life, I've thought about this, and then I just move on. So again, it's that bell curve where there's one end, the other end, and then everything in the middle.
And it makes complete sense. And I think this is it's so refreshing. It's so enlightening for just for me, and hopefully for adoptees, other adoptees listening to this, is because you've got the perspective. You've got the over 17 and a half years. You've seen probably thousands of, if not hundreds, probably thousands of
and just not just me. I mean, the Cradle is actually, we're in 2023, we're going to be celebrating our centennial. So we have almost 100 years, actually over 100 years, because our founder actually did her first adoption in 1914. So our records go back to 1914. And so it hasn't just been in the past 17 years that we've been talking to people post-adoption. Personally, I have, but the Cradle's been talking to people post-adoption for years. So there were, people before me that also passed on their knowledge about post-adoption. I think, post-adoption is sort of a newer thing, right? I mean, the years of closed adoption, post-adoption was not an issue. If somebody was looking for information, they were told, no, there either isn't any, which, that there's always information. It's just, is it not available? It's available. It just wasn't available, And so the idea of post-adoption and people learning things and wanting to connect or think about their adoption, that's, fairly new. I mean, I'd say the 80s was really when sort of here in the States where that became, it was happening before, but that's where it really, especially in Illinois, I can talk specifically because that's where we are. That's when the whole idea of openness started to really take shape, and that people may want to learn about their background and may want to, they were acknowledging it because obviously people wanted to learn about it earlier. It just wasn't okay. I think when I look back at our records, it was mostly, I mean, we always had some requests for information and wanting to talk about their background, but it was like the 70s, I'd say, when we first started to acknowledge and started to share information. Then it just built over time. And now it's the way adoptions are, right? This idea of openness and having information ahead and talking about adoption and preparing adoptive parents so that they can help their children with some of the issues as children as opposed to as adults.
Yeah. So I'm going to take you back to that bell curve.
Okay.
And I'm going to ask you what seems to me to be a tricky question, but
okay.
Why do you think there is this bell curve of different cause? I don't know what you would call it. Attribution? Would you call it attribution? Okay. Yeah. So we're like, I use this phrase a lot, a more idiomatic phrase, pinning the tail on the donkey.
Okay.
So a better, a posher word for that is attribution. So people saying, yeah, it's all adoption. Some people say it's all adoption. Others saying it's got nothing to do with adoption. And then you've got the mass in the middle. What do you think? What do you see as the reason for that spread?
That's a really good question. And I don't think it's just one thing. It has to be a combination, right? Because there's some, we're all born with just our nature, right? So I think there's some people, it's in their nature. I think it's the other combination of how was adoption talked about in the home, right? How was adoption incorporated into people's lives? What was a thought about birth parents, right? How did the family view birth parents and the decisions that were made? And then even over time, right, as an adoptive person grows up, like what relationships did they have? How did they think of the adoption and the circumstances? So I just don't think it's one thing. It's a combination of so many different things, and society, and what type of messages did they get, whether it was from society or their family or their friends. And then, of course, just your nature of how do you take things in, right? Some people are very sensitive. Some people are more stoic. So I think it's just a combination.
Yeah. Fascinating. I've got to, I don't, for me, it's a different, the answer is in a different place.
Okay.
The answer for me is in a kind of a how I am in the moment thing. Right. So how my mood has been up and down.
Okay.
In the 55 years on this planet, right?
I think that's very common. Like I said, kind of things ebb and flow, right? I mean, it depends on where you are in your life, what your circumstances are. Certainly milestones bring up some thoughts and feelings about adoption. And, if you know the age of your birth parents, right? Or specifically your birth mother when you were born, especially for a woman, right? So at that age, she's like, oh my goodness, like this is the age that my birth mother had me. And then other milestones like marriage, you kind of start thinking about questioning and wondering a little bit about the background, and then the birth of your own children, right? Those questions come up again. Those are stages where I feel like I get a lot of calls and inquiries and people questioning and wondering more.
Yeah.
And then maybe when your children are having children, and then of course later in life when you're thinking, oh my goodness, like if I don't look or find this or address this now, there's no time left. And so I think there's certain, of course there's ups and downs and ebbs and flows and different times where things are more meaningful or things make sense more, right? It's up and down, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's up and down. I think, and as you say, it's what's on our mind, really. So the life event, like a marriage or death of a loved one or whatever it is, the life event causes what's on our mind to change, and what's on our mind to change. What's on our mind drives how we feel in that moment, and that's the decisive. For me, that's the decisive factor. Have you come across this book called Power versus Force by David Hawkins?
I have not.
Yeah, it talks about levels of consciousness, and levels of consciousness is kind of like a posh word for mood or feelings. So it goes from 0 to 1,000, and 0 is dead, 20 is shame, a lot of shame around self-adoption. I think anger is something like, I can't remember, 50. Unconditional love is 500, and our level of consciousness goes up and down through our day, through our life.
Mm-hmm.
Always within a band, and that for me it's the level of consciousness ebbing and flowing to me that is the kind of the determining factor. So you talked about three core issues, as you saw them, of adoption. You talked about loss, rejection, and identity. So what have you learnt about how adoptees can navigate those issues?
Yeah. So, I just mentioned those three, but actually there's 7 core issues that have been identified by Deborah Silverstein and Sharon Kaplan in the 80s. And it's very interesting. And that's something that I've been focusing on in my work more recently. I've been doing some groups with the focus of those 7 core issues. And even at the Cradle, when we're doing our pre-adoptive education, those are the core, that's like the umbrella of which our pre-adoptive training goes for our adoptive parents. That's the umbrella under which our education program works. And because those core issues are really relevant for all members of the adoption circle, or some people refer to it as the triad. Now we think about a circle more than a triangle. But the 7 core issues it's really fascinating. And again, we were talking earlier before we started recording about how sometimes there's just intuition in terms of the things that we do as clinicians or people. And I've been talking to adult adoptive people and birth parents and adoptive parents for all these years. And then I came across these 7 core issues, and it was like, oh my gosh, that's what I've been talking about. That's what I've been doing all this time. And so with COVID and everything being virtual, we at the Cradle started offering these groups with the focus of the 7 core issues. And I've gotten such amazing feedback from adult adoptive people that have participated in the group series that I've been doing. And we talk about different issues, one issue each session. And it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, where some people said, oh, I never connected it with that. Like I knew that I struggled with maybe some identity or intimacy or some shame around my adoption, but I never connected it to these core issues. And so I've been really focused on the 7 core issues, and I'm actually running a support group right now for adopted parents of minors, because I heard from my adopted people in these groups that, man, I wish my parents would have known about these issues. And now, luckily for us at the Cradle, the adopted parents for many years now should know about these issues, because that's, like I said, that's the umbrella under which our education focuses on. But anyway, so this is a way to really focus on it. So the 7 core issues are loss, rejection, guilt and shame, grief, identity, intimacy, mastery, and control. And when we talk about those issues, when I talk to a person individually, I don't do therapy in my role at the Cradle. I provide support, guidance, more like consultation services to help people, think about what they're looking for. Are they looking for background information? Are they looking to make a connection with birth family? And then we talk about, like, what are their motivations? What are their expectations? What are the possible outcomes? And how would they incorporate all this new information into their lives? So I provide support and guidance around that. So if somebody's looking for more, more individualized, deeper work, we have counselors, and also obviously people can see counselors in their own area. But these issues, I think, are ones that should be focused on for adopted people.
So it's interesting, because sometimes, people say this, there's this old phrase, isn't there, knowledge is power. And my own experience was that with the primal wound, and a lot of those, ring true or ring true to the content of the primal wound. So I'm thinking, well, knowing this stuff took me down. Whereas I'm thinking, what's wrong with me now, right? It seemed like the adult adoptees that you're working with the support group, is that the knowledge, hearing about the 7 core issues is lightening up their lives.
Yeah, well, the other thing I think it's so important for adopted people, right? If you're just thinking about your adoption or some of these issues, and just consider this, right? An issue isn't a bad thing. It's a topic. It's just a thing. Somehow we've connected the word issue as like, ooh, it's a problem, but it's not, right? These are just issues that you work through and that are identified, but there's a way, there's a path, right? It doesn't mean that you're stuck in this position. It's a path. It's knowing what the issue is, looking at it, addressing it, seeing if it is something for you, right? It doesn't mean that everybody struggles with these issues, right? So it's a way to identify something. But the key factor, I will say, that with these groups, and why you have to look at the silver lining of everything that happened with the pandemic, and it allowed us to do these virtual groups. And where we're located in Evanston, which is just north of Chicago, and our adopted people are all over the country and all over the world. They can't come to Evanston for a support group, but doing this, during the pandemic, having the virtual, it was just like, oh my gosh, we never would have thought about this before. And I think the key for all of these adopted people was talking to other adopted people, right? Knowing that they aren't alone in some of their thoughts and feelings, and the way that they were thinking about some of these issues, and the way that they were maybe struggling or working through things, right? That they weren't alone. And that is overwhelmingly the feedback that I got, that it was just so great to be with other adult adopted people talking about specific topics, and hearing that other people felt the same way, or even if they didn't, it just was nice to be with other adopted people where you didn't have to explain certain things. You didn't have to go into the whole, well, I was adopted and I know I did or didn't search, or I do or don't want to search, and I know this or I don't know that. There was just a piece that people shared that they just could just get right into it. They didn't have to all of that other background that you typically would have to share with somebody when you're talking about things, you didn't have to. So I think that is a big part. So not only did people appreciate talking through some of these issues and identifying maybe some of the struggles that they had were connected to some of these things and how they worked through them, sharing that with other people like them was so helpful, and sharing and helping each other. That was really wonderful. I loved hearing, because I wasn't lecturing in this, a support group, right? These were adult adopted people in large groups and then in smaller groups, sharing with each other their own individual experiences, supporting each other, and even just saying, I understand. Oh, I understand. I've been there too. And this is what I tried, or this is how I worked through it. It was wonderful. And we just got such positive feedback from just the group, but then the topic also.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I'm thinking about my own self-criticism here, right? And I'm also thinking that I was, when I took what I took from the book and shared that with other people, that helped me go through the issue.
Yeah.
But you're doing it that way. People say there's a phrase that's often used with adoptive parents, and that the pain has been caused in relationship.
Okay.
So the healing gets done in relationships too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so they've got it is all about the connection with others.
Yeah. Well,
So
and I think, yeah, and not feeling like you're alone, right? Whatever it is, whether it's adoption or not, if there's something that you think that you're feeling or thinking, and maybe you think something's wrong with you. I apologize.
No worries.
I don't know if I can stop that right now. So
this is real life.
The working from home, or I guess even if I was in my office, the phone might ring too. But
you're in demand as an experienced individual and gifted.
Yeah. So sorry, that threw my train of thought. But I think even when I'm talking with people individually as well, right? Not just helping people, whether it's the adopted person or a birth parent or adopted parent, helping them understand that. I say all the time, people say, well, I don't know if you've heard this before, but whatever. And I'm like, I know it's really important and meaningful to you, but no, you're not. This is not the first time I've heard that. And so by reassuring people when it comes to adoption, the things that they're thinking or feeling, that they're not alone, I can hear that relief on the other end of the phone, right? So I don't just do these groups. I have also, individual consultations. And like I said, a lot of it is just helping people with their sort of where they are, and just recognizing that these are common feelings that they have, because when you don't have the opportunity to talk to other people, you don't know that these core issues are relevant for everybody in adoption and not just you as an individual. So it's wonderful now that there's so many opportunities, right? There's so many books out there and podcasts and webinars about educating all members of the adoption circle, and now support groups, whether they're in person or online or virtual, whatever it may be. It's certainly helpful, I think.
Yeah. So if I go back to the top and look down on what you just shared, we're talking number one here. We're talking about knowledge, like the knowledge of the 7 cores, yeah. And then number 2 they're talking about is community. So you're kind of like exploring that knowledge in a community, and that is the well, going, you talked about shame as one of the 7 core issues. So shame is dissolved by hearing other people feel the same way as you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's not, I'm not wrong for feeling like that.
Mm-hmm.
Other
Yeah.
people feel the same as me.
Right.
And so we are less ashamed, I guess. I don't know. I mean, how would you, given that obviously we're not doing a support group meeting now,
Right.
we're just talking about the support group. There is what can you share from that support group, given the limits of this format as a conversation between 2 people, that you'd like to share to help the listeners?
Yeah, I mean, I think for people, first, I would recommend just Googling the 7 core issues of adoption. I think that's a good place to start, because even if you just read a little bit about each topic, it may be meaningful. And the other thing that's really significant about the way that they shared this information is they talk about these 7 core issues in relation to all members of the adoption circle, right? So adoption doesn't just affect the adopted person, right? Adoption also, it starts with the birth parent and the adopted parents, and there's the child too, right? So what I like about the way that they share this information is they talk about all of these issues in relation to each member of the adoption circle, right? It's not just in a vacuum. And I think that's important too, right? I think it was really helpful for my adopted people to read how this affected maybe their birth parents, or how this affected their adopted parents. And even in the group that I'm in now, talking about it with adopted parents, I think it's really important for them not only to focus on themselves in relation to this, but to think about how these issues affect their child, who's a minor, which, who's going to grow, and how these issues may impact them over their life. So I'd say the first thing for your listeners is just Google the 7 core issues of adoption and read about it. It's really different for everybody, right? Because when you think about identity, just learning about your background, from maybe if you were adopted through an agency, getting that non-identifying background information, or perhaps your parents know some information, or I'm not sure what the rules are by you, but if you're able to get some background information, I think that helps a lot, right? That's not about contact. That's not about making a connection with birth family. It goes back to what you said a few minutes ago, knowledge, right? Learning about the circumstances of the adoption, the thoughts and feelings of your birth parents, why the decision was made, and then just having a little bit of knowledge, like what they looked like, how old were they. That I think helps with identity, just to know a little bit more. And then if you are interested in making a connection, and you can actually meet birth parents and see where you get some of your traits and your characteristics and your physical features, and then you can actually learn more about the adoption from the people who made the decision, right? That is really helpful with identity, but that's not for everybody, right? Not everybody is interested in making a connection. For some people, just learning about their background is enough. So it's hard for me to say you have to do this or you have to do that. These things can be helpful and meaningful for different people. Some people, just getting the information that's amazing. That's all they wanted. And other people, they need to see and meet and hear directly. But that's just one example of the identity, right? Is knowing where you came from, knowing about your background, knowing who your birth parents are. That can help with that identity. I think you mentioned the shame. That's a hard one, because when we think about the people that we're talking about, for the most part, were adopted during the closed adoption world, right? So there isn't the information there unless you seek it out. You don't have any information about the birth parents unless you seek it out. And that shame goes hand in hand with that secrecy, right? When something's a secret, it makes it seem like it's something bad that you shouldn't talk about or you shouldn't know. So it's harder to erase that, because that's the way adoptions were at that time, right? But if you can kind of peel that away and learn a little bit more, then maybe that will help with that, right? You can't erase the that's the way adoptions were. They were secret, but maybe you can move forward. So there's certainly different topics that are meaningful and have different ways. I mean, we start with loss, right? I mean, adoption stems from loss for all members of the adoption circle. And it's how you work through that and how you can look at those gains on the other side. You know, yes, there's losses, but certainly there were gains and there were reasons. And so that's helpful. So that's just a taste of what some of the things that we talk about.
Yeah. I think it's, you make a very interesting and a valid point that it's different for everybody. And I came up with something last year, which has really helped my life, which I like to share. If people are feeling overwhelmed, listeners are feeling overwhelmed, and the approach is a no-brainer approach, right? So if I feel that something is a no-brainer, I do it.
Okay.
If I'm confused, I don't do it. So I apply this in lots of different things, from little things to big things.
Yeah.
So, when the time is right, it was a no-brainer. So my tracking back of my story there were two major parts, two or three major points, and they were no-brainers.
Okay.
So I got my original birth certificate with the name of my biological mother on, and at that point it was, I've had two names. That's a little bit strange, but I didn't, it wasn't traumatic for me at that moment. But it got to that point, and I didn't feel the need to go to the next point, and it didn't feel that I had the name, but I didn't continue the search. And then I can't remember how long ago it was, but I had a meeting with a therapist when I thought I had a problem with this stuff. And something I had a quite a visceral experience of my birth mother being outside the room and so-called rejecting me again. Right, that was the idea that kind of floated into my head. Well, it didn't float into my head; it kind of hit me like a steamroller between the eyes, really. And I just thought, I'm not going to let this fear stop me. And I took I restarted the search journey. So yeah, I would, if you're feeling conflicted or confused, listeners, I would encourage you to maybe let things settle, and if you like the sound of this no-brainer strategy, don't do anything until it's a no-brainer. Till you get we were talking about intuition, weren't we, before we started?
But I couldn't agree more with you. I in my role, most often what I'm doing is helping people learn what their options are and think about taking that next step. And we get a lot of inquiries. I have a lot of phone calls, and not everyone moves forward. And I say exactly what you just went through. That's what we talk about, right? If this is something that's really meaningful and important to you, then great. If you're questioning, then maybe this isn't the right time. Now you took this step, you know what your options are. And when the time is right, if the time is right, then you can move forward and get the birth certificate, or you can get the background information, or you can search. It can be baby steps. It could be all at once. It just depends on the individual, where they're feeling. But you said the word fear, and I say that all the time, right? Fear is what holds us back, right? Fear of the unknown, fear of the potential rejection again, right? On both sides, whether you're the birth parent searching or the adopted person searching. And I talk with people, whether even if it's just getting the information, right? Who knows what's in that packet of information and what you might learn. And that's why we talk about, like, what are your motivations? What are your expectations? What are the possible outcomes? What's your worst case scenario? What's your best case scenario? And if you think about those and work through those, and you feel like, I can manage that worst case scenario. If I open a can of worms, I hear that all the time, can of worms, Pandora's box, you name it. I've heard all of those phrases on the phone when I talk to people. If you feel like you can handle what's on the other end of that, then you have your answer. If you're unsure, or you know you can't, then maybe this isn't the right step for you right now. So I couldn't agree. I haven't heard that no-brainer, but I think that that's similar to what I'm describing here.
Yeah, and it's useful to have that third party to talk these things through, right?
Definitely.
To think about the implications.
Yeah. And I also go back to you mentioned really correctly, the community, right? Talking to or hearing from other adopted people and what their experiences were. How did they go about searching for information or a connection? And how did that go for them, right? Obviously, no two experiences are going to be the same, because no two stories are the same. But hearing from people who have had incredible outcomes is helpful. And then hearing from people who have had more difficult outcomes, I think that's helpful too, because it helps you as an individual think, okay, well, if that happened to me, I think I could handle that, right? Because it may or may not work out. We just don't know. We're dealing with humans, right? So you may make a connection or learn information, and it's exactly the way you thought it was going to be. And you may also learn information or make a connection, and it just doesn't click. Maybe people are in different places in their lives, or obviously we have to always consider that there's mental health issues, substance abuse issues, different lifestyles. So even though this might be this is your biological relation, I mean, you're strangers, you don't know each other. And there's things that have happened in life since, in whatever, 50 years ago or whatever it might be, is when this adoptions place, there's this whole life that has happened. So, I think community is really important also.
Yeah. And how, so there's a million and one things that can happen, and thinking this all through, I guess, kind of reduces the fear, doesn't it? Reduce the looking at what could happen.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of reduces the fear.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's
what you're trying to do. Yeah. Do you get a lot of people coming to you thinking that the finding out the truth, the reunion, do you get a lot of people a bit naive about that? Like, this is going to solve my problems once, so I'm talking about, so I wasn't like that. Mm-hmm. But where I was in, because I told you earlier on that I had some challenges around business. Mm-hmm. And I thought, once I get to this, then that's going to be everything. That's going to be okay. Mm-hmm. I'm going to, once I get my business making money every month, then I'm going to be happy. So I kind of like pinned my hopes, right? Mm-hmm. And then I hit this profit target, and it didn't do anything for me, right? Mm-hmm. But I was pinning a lot of hopes. On that, and then when it happened, it was no biggie, right? So do you get a lot of people pinning a lot of hopes
Mhm.
that finding my birth mother is going to solve my psychological issues, emotional issues. Do you get people doing
Yeah.
that?
So, because I'm not the therapist, I don't know all of the intimate,
No.
the details of what somebody might talk about with their therapist and what they're truly thinking, right? Um, I would say that many people that do move forward with trying to reach out and make a connection with birth family members, I think that they're looking to find answers to questions or looking for that missing piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
And I don't think I've ever, maybe a few times, had somebody say, along the lines of what you said, that it'll be the answer to everything. But most, I haven't heard that. But again, because I'm not their therapist, they may not have shared that with me. Maybe that's what they're thinking. But I haven't, I think it's more just answering some questions, right? Puzzle piece, just kind of helping bring things together. And they think that will help. If it doesn't work out, if they aren't able to get the answers to those questions, I haven't, in general, people aren't saying, oh, I'm going to be devastated if I can't. Most people are hopeful. Otherwise, why would you do this? You're hopeful that you're going to get those answers. You're hopeful that you're going to be able to get that last piece of the puzzle, and that it will answer questions.
So I'm gonna use your bell curve back on you as a way to kind of
probably the same thing.
Yeah. So on one, okay. So if this was a bell curve, what would be?
Sure. Yeah.
What would be the words?
Yeah.
Either end.
Yeah. So I would say on one end, if like as you said, like this, if I find my birth parents, this will be the answer to everything. It'll help make everything make sense. And I'll have all the answers and I'll understand why I am the way I am, or why certain things have turned out in my life, or why I've had certain struggles, right? So that's one end of the bell curve, which I think you're alluded to. Right. And then, the other end is like, why that has no meaning for me. Why would I even consider finding my birth parents? That has nothing to do with who I am. So that's that's the opposite side.
Yeah.
Or whatever decision that was made. I mean, okay, I was adopted. This is my life.
Yeah. Fascinating. The ones I came up with, because I was thinking about the people that contacted you, right? So if they've contacted you because they think it's regarding search, because they think it might be of help to them. So that if they didn't think it had anything relevance to them, they wouldn't be ringing you. So I was thinking about one end of the bell curve being hopeful. Well, I put curiosity. I can never say that word.
Yeah.
Hopeful curiosity. I put curiosity, and then you said they're coming at this from positive, or else they wouldn't win it. So then I put hopeful curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
At the other end of the bell curve, I put all in desperation.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think it just depends. I was looking at it a little bit differently, but you're right. Like, why, if you're thinking about somebody specifically who's considering looking, right, that would fit, right? Somebody who's just, well, I'm just curious. I just want to see what's there. And then somebody else, as I said before, who I need to have this information, it answers everything. So I think you're right.
Yeah. But the way
I do get a lot of that. I mean, I'd say most often people begin with, I'm just curious. I just have a couple questions. I just want to know where this came from, or I just want my medical. I'm looking for my medical. That's where people start, and then it builds from there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they're talking to a stranger. So they're gonna downplay it first.
Yeah.
Now I'm curious about your little dog that's just
So I had my
picture.
Yeah. So my dog was here sleeping at my feet, and I guess was lulled by our conversation. And we got into the good stuff, and she just woke up. Like, what's going on now? What are you talking about?
And she's what, a Labradoodle, is she, or something?
Golden doodle.
She's a golden doodle, but she's black, a black golden doodle.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. I mean, I was thinking we've got 2 Labradors, right? So they come to us when they want feeding, being Labrador.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, she's always ready to eat, but I shouldn't have said that word out loud because she.
Don't say food. Don't say dinner.
Now she's just moved to a different spot. It's a rough
cute.
life being a dog, sleep in one part of the room, then go to the other part of the room, and then go on a walk, and then go back to sleep.
Yeah, it's a dog's life. So that's been an incredible conversation. I've really enjoyed that, and that perspective that you bring of from the years, and obviously all the years being in it, and then how all the learnings from in these 100 or coming up for 100 years from the cradle have kind of been infused into you, like it's a shared knowledge, and it's built on. I think that gives incredible perspective, and I think that's what changes our world, when our perspective changes.
Yeah.
And so that's what the podcast is all about, is sharing perspectives, sharing learnings, and those 2 points about the community and about understanding in community as the things that as the things that move the needle in adoptees' mental health and emotional well-being, I think is right. Is there anything that I've not asked you that you'd like to share?
I think based on the conversation and what we were talking about today, I feel like we did a pretty thorough job. I mean, there's lots of other topics that we could have many other conversations about another time. But I think we covered what we wanted to, where we're going with this conversation today.
Brilliant. So yeah, I'd love to have another conversation later in the year if you're up for that. And I would encourage listeners to check out the show notes. We'll be linked to the Cradle and to the social channels, and because they're doing some great work, clearly doing some great work with these support groups, and meaningful, positive support groups are what's required in a world that's full of trauma dumping Facebook groups that don't really seem to help people do anything but express their terrible stuff that they're going through. That we need different perspectives, and we need different views, and we need to heal in community, not just not just bleed in community. That's a bit of a strange thing to say, but yeah, we do need to heal in community. Sure. So thank you very much, Nina. It's been a great conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us. Yes, you're welcome. Thank you for having me. I enjoyed communicating and conversing and sharing all this with you as well. That's great. Thanks a lot, listeners, and we'll speak to you very soon. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.